Hi, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I am Julie Zuckerman, the author of the book of Jeremiah, for those of you who don't know me. And welcome to the August Literary Modiin author event. It's kind of crazy days here in Israel. It has been for the last 10 months. We are on day 303, still waiting and praying for our hostages to return home and return to normalcy. And I'll say more about that at the end of the war, but just another word before we turn to our main subject. For those of you who are outside of Israel right now, things must feel a little surreal and worrisome, but I just want to say that, I'm still kind of going about my normal daily routine, daily life. I go to work, the train is full, work is full. I just came from the pool because it's my new favorite thing in the summer is to go swimming after work. And there's like hundreds of screaming kids in my local pool with bouncy castles and everything. So we are still going on, even as things are a bit on edge and the airlines are canceling their flights. So just a note about that. Anyway, now I want to turn to something very joyful, and that is the release of new Jewish books into the world. Literary Modiin has been around for over 5 years. This is our 52nd event. It started as in-person events in Modiin, and with the pandemic, we switched to Zoom, as you know. The format of today's event is that each author speaks for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And we have a large attendance today, so everyone is on mute. But you can put your questions in the chat box, and if you have any technical difficulties, send a private note in the chat to me. This is being recorded, so and I'll send out a link to the recording tomorrow, which you can feel free to share or catch up. Okay, I'm going to introduce our first author. Ellis Shuman is an American-born Israeli author, travel writer, and book reviewer. His writing has appeared in the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, and the Huffington Post. His short fiction has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and has appeared in Iseli magazine, I'm pronouncing that wrong, Vagabond, The Right Launch, Esoterica, Jewish Literary Journal, San Antonio Review, and other literary publications. He's the author of The Virtual Kibbutz, Valley of Thracians, The Burgess Affair, and now RAKIYA. So I'm going to spotlight which person, for those who don't know, my daughter's name is RAKIYA. So of course I love the title of Ellis's book. And let me unmute. Oh, wrong person to ask to unmute. There I go.
Okay.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. So thank you, Julie, for inviting me. Julie and I worked together many years ago, but have stayed connected because of many shared interests, including writing. So it's an honor to share the stage tonight with Danila and Maxim. I look forward to hearing about your books. I'm excited to present my own new book, RAKIYA Stories of Bulgaria, which was published in June. Bulgaria. What's a book about Bulgaria doing in tonight's lineup? Admittedly, I knew nothing about Bulgaria when 15 years ago, my boss in a Tel Aviv online marketing company informed me that my position was being relocated to Sofia. He said either that I accepted a 2-year relocation contract or someone else would take my current position. And I had 1 week to decide whether to accept the offer. Well, my wife and I accepted the challenge. Our kids had grown up. Our parents were relatively capable of caring for themselves. And we found a house sitter who could take care of our 2 cats. We arrived in Sofia in an unseasonably warm January, which was followed days later by a heavy snowstorm, and our Bulgarian adventure began. During our 2 years in Bulgaria, we fell in love with the country, its picturesque villages, stunning nature, everything so green, mountains and forests everywhere. We learned about Bulgaria's rich history, culture, and traditions. We prayed in Sofia's synagogue, attending its 100th year anniversary. Bulgaria as a whole is a very secular country, but one that honors its religious heritage with countless monasteries to visit. The people are very friendly and extend warm hospitality. They nod to say no, shake their heads to say yes. They tie a red and white string bracelet around their wrists on March 1st to welcome the spring. We enjoyed living in Sofia, a modern city which still has old world Eastern European feel. We even took a liking to RAKIYA, Bulgaria's traditional alcoholic drink. We studied, but ultimately failed to master the Bulgarian language. There's one thing we learned that surprised us more than anything else, and that was the story of Bulgarian Jewry during World War II. Despite being an ally of the Nazis, the country's entire Jewish community, all 48,000 Jews living in the country at the start of the war, survived the Holocaust. That said, 11,343 Jews living in Macedonia and Thrace, Bulgarian-controlled territories during those years, were sent to their deaths in the extermination camps in Poland. How did Bulgaria's Jews survive the Holocaust? Who saved them? Who is responsible for the deaths of Macedonia's Jews? I'll come back to those questions in a minute. Our stay in Sofia came to an end, and back home in Israel, I realized that my heart remained in Bulgaria. I found that I could return to Bulgaria every day through my writing. I began writing travel articles about Bulgaria, encouraging tourists to visit the country, and I began writing fiction with Bulgaria as its setting. My first novel, Valley of Thracians, tells the story of an American Peace Corps volunteer who goes missing in Bulgaria, and his grandfather sets out on a mission to find him. The Thracians, by the way, were militant tribes that ruled in the Balkans 4,000 years ago. My second novel, The Burgas Affair, is a fictional account of the follow-up to the very real terrorist attack at Burgas Airport in July 2012. A suicide bomber killed 5 Israelis and their Bulgarian bus driver. It is assumed that the bomber was sent by Hezbollah. In my novel, a young Israeli woman on her first overseas mission on behalf of the Mossad teams up with a steadfast Bulgarian detective to track down the perpetrators. And now I return to Bulgaria in my book, RAKIYA, Stories of Bulgaria, a collection of 12 short stories told in the voices of native Bulgarians and foreigners visiting the country for the first time. The story, Mother and Daughter, follows a Romani woman who resorts to pickpocketing to support her young daughter who suffers from a severe speech impediment. Sozopol tells of a struggling Israeli author who attends an international writing conference but ends up accused of murdering one of the participants. In the story, The Baker, a refugee from the Syrian civil war, once a doctor in Damascus, has made a new home for himself and his family in Sofia, where an unexpected visitor arrives at the bakery where he now works. And I'm going to read from this story, The Baker. I've heard you make the best pitas in all of Sofia. Who am I to argue with what people say? Jamal said, looking up from the cash register to find a well-dressed middle-aged man drumming his fingers on the counter. What can I get you? Would it be possible to make an order for 150? Jamal stepped back, not surprised at the large order, but that the man was speaking to him in colloquial Arabic. I'm sure that can be arranged, he said, turning to his brother for confirmation. Standing near one of the ovens, Amar nodded his consent. Good, the customer said. I will pay you now in advance. Could you have the order ready if I come by tomorrow at 3? Jamal rang up the purchase and handed over the change and a receipt. Dovishna, he said, instinctively saying goodbye in Bulgarian. Shukran, the man replied in Arabic as he left the bakery. He's Israeli, Amar said, slapping Jamal on the shoulder and sending a small cloud of flour to settle on the keys of the register. No, that can't be true. Jamal picked up a dust cloth, but paused, thinking of the stranger's dark features that would not seem out of place on the streets of Damascus. Middle Eastern accent, for sure. Maybe is Iraqi or Egyptian, certainly not Israeli. Didn't you see his car? It has red diplomatic license plates. What would an Israeli be doing in our bakery? He knows where we're from. He came here for the pitas like everyone else. Why are you complaining? It's good business. An Israeli visiting a Syrian bakery in Bulgaria? Jamal smiled to himself. There had been stranger things, but then a thought came to him. He would talk to the man, Jamal decided, and ask him where he's from. If he was an Israeli, as Amar claimed, perhaps they could have a conversation. Strange bedfellows they were for sure, but maybe it would be possible to have a meaningful discussion with him to bridge their cultural and political differences. Jamal had a chance to make peace with someone who had once been an enemy. He looked forward to the Israelis' return to the bakery. The man would appreciate Jamal's goodwill, and more than that, he would be very satisfied with the pitas. Other stories in the book take readers into the depths of Bulgaria's most famous cave and to the peak of the country's highest mountain. And the title story, RAKIYA, is the tale of two villagers who are competing to produce the best homemade alcoholic drink, RAKIYA. Now back to the story of Bulgarian Jewry surviving World War II. The story is quite unfamiliar to most Jews. I knew I needed to relate to it in my writing, but I had never previously written historical fiction. With plans to write a novel, I conducted extensive research, including interviewing historians and journalists, studying the testimonies of survivors, and spending hours in the library at Yad Vashem. I learned there was quite a bit of controversy involved. The role of Tsar Boris III, who stood beside Hitler at the 1936 Olympic Games, is questionable. Once honored as savior of the Jews, he is no longer credited with their survival. So who rescued the Jews? How did they survive? Even today, the answer to that question is not entirely clear. Because of this controversy, I knew anything I wrote would be rejected by some as not accurately following the facts. Yet, I needed to include this story in my book. The result is Forgiveness, the longest story in RAKIYA. In Forgiveness, an Israeli man receives an unexpected invitation to come to Bulgaria. Forgiveness. The village was nestled in green foothills not far from the Greek border. Quaint wooden farmhouses and ramshackle barns, cultivated fields of summer crops, fenced-off pastures spotted with dairy cows and goats, grassy meadows bordered by colorful wildflowers. In the distance, snow-capped peaks below a cloudless blue sky. The Rhodope Mountains, scenic and bucolic, home to some of Bulgaria's oldest citizens. One of them was waiting to see me. My grandfather is 95 years old, Anna reminded me as we drove south on the narrow highway. He's half blind, walks, doesn't hear very well, but he still has his wits about him. He rises at the crack of dawn to milk his cow and tends his vegetable afternoon. And he eats a lot of yogurt, she added with a laugh. I can't believe I'm here, that I've flown all the way from Tel Aviv just to meet him. He's very eager to see you, Anna continued to talk excitedly as she drove, but I remained mostly silent, keeping my eyes focused on the beautiful countryside. I was looking forward to meeting him as well, but I had a growing feeling of trepidation ahead of my visit to his home. Why had I come to Bulgaria? Had I made a mistake? Was I on a wild goose chase that would make me a laughingstock when I returned to my office in a few days' time? I shook my head, shocked at my impulsive decision to come. Anna slowed down when we passed the sign announcing our arrival in Gela, the village that was our destination. A minute later, she parked the car. I got out, took a deep breath of fresh mountain air, and followed her up the gravel path to a wooden farmhouse that had seen better days. We took off our shoes outside the door and went inside. It took several minutes for my eyes to fully acclimate to the dark interior. Outside, it was a warm June day, but inside the farmhouse, I shivered. The unlit fireplace at the side of an open kitchen made me wonder how warm the room was in winter. The Rhodopes were here, Anna said, pointing at a low bench near the dining room table. My mother's probably shopping in Smolyan. I'll go see if my grandfather's awake. I sat down, looked around the rustic, homey room. Watercolor paintings of green landscapes hung on one wall, a window open to real-life vistas of the same. All the furniture was wooden, apparently homemade. I rested my hands on a colorful embroidered tablecloth, kicked my backpack under the table, and fidgeted as I waited for Anna's grandfather. All I knew was that he had something to give me, and I didn't have a clue what it could be. As the story progresses, we learn that Alexander, the old Bulgarian man, has a collection of old letters to share, letters that he had received from the Israeli's grandfather, Avraham. The two had grown up together on the streets of Sofia, best friends. When World War II broke out, Avraham was sent to Bulgarian forced labor camps. His story is documented in the letters he wrote to his friend, including this one from June 1943, in which he describes conditions in the village where he's being held with his sister and parents. From the story. During the first 2 hours of each day, no food is served. When the morning meal is finally available, it is nothing but a slice or two of stale bread and a lukewarm cup of tea. Lunch comprises more bread and a bowl of watery bean soup. Our meager meals are often supplemented with food brought to the camp by Christian residents of the nearby villages, kind Bulgarian citizens making sure we don't go hungry. Conditions are hard, but we survive. No one knows how long we will be here, but most presume it will be until the war ends, whenever that will be. Our future is uncertain. We know of Jews who were transported across Bulgaria on trains bound for Lom. They were sent on barges to Poland, to the Auschwitz camp where they were murdered by the Nazis. Mass shootings or worse. From Samovid, we can see ships docked on the Danube. We fear this will be our fate as well. Despite the harsh conditions, the threat of deportation, the fear of the fate that awaits us on the other side of the river, we have hope. We know many Bulgarians are working diligently to secure our release, ordinary citizens and even some politicians. I hope to hear from you soon before they take us away from the camp, before they force us to leave our beloved Bulgaria. Alexander, meanwhile, was a Bulgarian soldier serving in Macedonia and responsible, in a way, for sending the local Jews to their deaths. Would the two friends separated by war ever reunite? Would Avraham ever forgive Alexander for his role in the Jews' deportation and death? The answer is in my book, RAKIYA, Stories of Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, when you raise a glass of RAKIYA, you look each other in the eyes and make a toast in a word that means to your health, or l'chaim. Na zdravie. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellis. Thank you very much. Okay, let me introduce our next author. Maxim D. Shrayer, bilingual author, scholar, and translator, was born in Moscow in 1967 to a Jewish-Russian family and immigrated to the United States in 1987. A professor at Boston College, he has authored and edited more than 25 books. His recent poetry collections include the Russian language, I'm not going to be able to say this right, Shticky is a Pada, and the English language of politics and pandemics, and Kinship, which we'll be talking about tonight. Among Maxim's other books are the literary memoirs Waiting for America, Leaving Russia, and Immigrant Baggage. He is the recipient of a 2007 National Jewish Book Award and a 2012 Guggenheim Fellowship. His works have been translated into 13 languages, and he lives in Boston with his wife and daughters and their silver joodle. That's the first time I ever heard of a joodle, Maxim. And I should say that there he is. He doesn't look so silver. He looks black. And I should say this is Maxim's third time on Literary Modiin, because you were here for Immigrant Baggage and one of our Solidarity events, and now tonight. So
yes, good afternoon, and
take it away.
Those of you in Israel, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to meet Ellis and Danila and to see Julie again. We've been friends and colleagues and literary collaborators for some time, and we finally met last May in Israel when Julie very kindly took me along to volunteer picking fruit, plums and apricots at a farm in central Israel, and that was an incredible experience. So thank you so much, and Julie, thanks again. Toda rabba. And as Julie mentioned, I will be speaking about my most recent book, this book, which is also the background, Kinship. And it's a poetry collection published by Finishing Line Press out of Kentucky, which is mainly a poetry collection. And I'm very grateful to them because the book is all about Jewish identity at various crossroads, and this press continues to publish books with Jewish concerns and Jewish agendas, which is becoming, I think, more and more difficult for the publishers. In any case, this book is about questions of Jewish identity as they are affected by several specific events and perspectives. The first is the war in Ukraine. So when Russia attacked Ukraine back in February 2022, and by the way, Kinship is the title poem, a longish poem, which negotiates my relationship with Ukraine. So when I remember waking up to the news that Russia attacked Ukraine, and I felt simultaneously a mix of emotions. It's terrible. It's Putin's neo-colonial war, but also I felt this kinship with Ukraine, even though, you know, only three of my four late grandparents were born and grew up there. Both my parents were born in European Russia, in Moscow and Leningrad, but we have a very strong sense of roots in Ukraine. And of course, the vast majority of ex-Soviet Jews have roots in Ukraine or the Greater Poland, because the borders have shifted so much. And I felt this is also, in a sense, my war, because as a descendant of Ukrainian Jews, I have a stake in this. And that, in turn, gave the initial impulse to the whole collection. So that's one piece, and I'll read a poem that illustrates this point. The other part is Jewishness in present-day America. I'm an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, a former refusenik. My parents and I came here in 1987, so I was 20. So I've lived in America for more than my life, more than half of my life, and in Boston longer than I had in Moscow. And yet the past 3 years have really, in a sense, redefined my relationship with America, its mainstream. And questions of anti-Semitism in America are also questions that I negotiate in the book. That's two. Three is questions of the Soviet legacy. I'm sure some of you are hearing quite a bit again now the political conversations where pundits ask, in my view, ill-conceived questions along the lines of why is it that the majority of ex-Soviet Jews support Trump? I think that's not the question that should be asked. I think the question is, why are the majority of Soviet Jews the way they are? And I think if we understand that, other explanations will follow more naturally. But certainly, I am very interested in exploring how the Soviet legacy is still with us here today in America, in Canada, in Israel, of course, where now the critical, between Israel, America, and Canada, and Germany, the critical mass of ex-Soviet or Russophone Jews are now living. There are only 120,000 Jews left in all of post-Soviet states, imagine. So it's clearly the endspiel of Jewish Russian history. So I probe these questions. And lastly, there are poems and also a whole cycle which explore in a kind of partly archaeological fashion and part in a more emotional fashion, my connection to Israel, which is really the home of my heart, where my side of the family and my wife's side of the family have numerous relatives, and where I visit frequently. And there are some poems that have to do with, of course, the book had already been written before October 7th, but when I was checking the copy edited manuscript, I was able to make some changes, and I actually in small ways addressed the war. The book that I've since written, which will be coming out with Ben Yehuda Press, will be entirely about the war in Israel. So in any case, without further ado, let me read a little bit for you. And Julie, please stop me when I've run out of time, because when you read poems, time somehow has a way of disappearing. So the first poem I'll read has to do with the war in Ukraine, and it has to do with the great city of Odessa, which of course is a city that has a special place in Jewish history, and also it was a very multicultural city. And when Odessa was being bombed, I kept thinking, well, what can I do? Or what perhaps not I can do, but what can poets do to help Odessa? And I had this idea that poets would form a certain defense league that would protect Odessa from the air raids. And so in this poem, I get into various different poets representing different identities and languages who have lived in Odessa, who have loved Odessa, who left it, of course, most famously in the case of Hebrew poetry, Bialik, and kind of how they are responding to this. The bombing of Odessa. O Russia, my birthland, I pity your destiny. Russian troops are bombing Odessa. Putin's generals, death and deputy, craving Odessa, a fallen Odessa. As desperate missiles descend on Odessa, poets and sages come to its rescue. They summon the shadows of fellow singers who once lived and loved in this city of cities. They wrote in Yiddish, Ukrainian, Russian, Hebrew, and Polish, Tatar, and Italian. From verses of the past, they are rising like zealots not to allow the murder of Odessa. Bialik is counting the wounded and the dead. Now the city of slaughter is here in Odessa. Akhmatova, lithe like a Black Sea deity, unsheathes her father's Damascus naval dagger. Shimon Frug, the Jewish Aeolian harpist, thrusts a stick hand grenade under his belt. Sasha Chorny, the scion of Odessan pharmacists, is preparing bottles of anti-tank cocktails. Żabo Zhabotinsky, of course. Żabo, fiercely smiling like a conjurer at play, commands a unit of harbor patrol. Lesia Ukrainka, Khadjibey's salty air, takes an old shotgun from the Dutch's dusty attic. Bunin trades in his ornate walking stick for a Mauser rifle with a sword bayonet. Volodymyr Sosura mounts a Maxim gun on the dome of the Opera House at dawn. Febrile Bagritsky from Deribasovka's roofs sends postal doves to Ukrainian troops. Their voices and weapons form a sound defense to deter Russia's weapons of death. Undefeatable and ambidextrous, we shall always fight for you, my Odessa. And I add a footnote that, of course, in addition to solidarity, one feels a mix of emotions when Odessa, on the one hand, is being bombed by Russian troops, but on the other is changing the names of its writers, many of whom Russian Jews, unnaming them. I think it's an additional casualty of the war. I'm sure there'll be a recorrection when Ukraine emerges victorious. But for now, that's where we are. Now, the next poem I'll read will illustrate the poems that negotiate my relationship with the Soviet past. This one is called L'Éducation Sentimentale, which is a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to the famous novel by Flaubert, Sentimental Education. Of course, it was largely an unsentimental education that we received in Soviet schools, in which, by the way, traditionally, a lot of Jewish women worked as men as well, but more women worked as school teachers, and particularly school teachers of Russian language and literature. L'Éducation Sentimentale. Soviet women past their prime in aubergine turtlenecks washed to a sheen. Vera Josephovna Perlbaum, Lyubov Leonidovna Bernstein, public detractors of Stalin, secret admirers of Pasternak, keepers of old family cooking styles, cloves and garlic, celery and parsnip. Dear children, you must love the classics. They preached in voices laced with pain as our masters shot down a South Korean liner west of Sakhalin in the Sea of Japan. The English teacher, she's no dummy, spoke one classmate. Jews are usually smart. I stared out the window. Fucking Russian teacher, spoke another classmate, the sniveling Jew bitch. I smashed the window. All the world's a stage and we are merely players. Repeated Vera Vilyamovna Perlstein. Children, drop by drop, squeeze out the slave. Repeated Lyubov Antonovna Birnbaum. Outside the window, the warm-hearted playboy Brezhnev was dying. After him, the bloodthirsty spy master Andropov was dying. After him, the timid party secretary Chernenko was dying. Then Gorbachev fought for his spot under the sun of the dying. We read Lady with Lapdog. We memorized Shakespeare's sonnets. We learned to love and betray one another. A whole lifetime wouldn't be enough to shake the memories of this rancorous theater. As you can see, there are references to Chekhov and Shakespeare, and when you read this poem, you will see that these Jewish names are actually synthetic names because incorporated in them are first names of writers, including Anton Chekhov and William Shakespeare, which in a sense makes these Jewish teachers of Russian language heiresses to world culture, but also having to exhale both truth and lies to their students on a daily basis. And that too is part of the legacy that Soviet Jews brought with them to places where they now live. Now, I would like to read a poem now that illustrates the third strand in the book, which is questions of anti-Semitism and the general climate for Jewish self-expression, which, of course, is probably felt most acutely by those of us who have children in schools, in universities, and those who are educators like myself. So this poem, it's called Stronger. I originally wrote it for the bat mitzvah of my younger daughter, Tatiana, and then actually I revised it for the book because things were getting only worse. And it, I guess, illustrates the sense that many of our kids feel, particularly in the public schools, that somehow there is not room for any Jewish agenda, that basically the Jewish identity, the Jewish history is virtually obfuscated. So it has an epigraph from Bertolt Brecht, who was very good at putting his finger on very raw nerves of any society. And this is from a famous poem that became also a song. Mein junger Sohn fragt mich, soll ich Geschichte lernen? Which means my younger son asked me, should I study history? And then in Brecht's poem, there is an elaborate answer. And in mine, there is a different, not as elaborate, but still an answer. My younger daughter asked me while writing a paper on anti-Semitism. The teacher told us to come up with arguments against our own theses. Papa, I'm confused. What should I tell him? You tell him, I said, there's no argument against truth. Tell him a thesis in favor of prejudice would be an impossible ruse. 6 months later, my younger daughter asked me, after getting her history syllabus, there are many kinds of prejudice here, but not a word about Jew hatred. I feel like we've been thrown under the bus. Papa, what should I say to the teacher? Say to her that selective justice is a form of bigotry. You say to her they cannot hide the evidence, no matter how hard they try. On the eve of her bat mitzvah, I asked my younger daughter, Tanyusha, how do you feel? She put her hand on my shoulder, lightly, gently, like my older angel. I'm good, Papa, she answered. I'm stronger. So that's that. And I think I'm going to conclude with Julie, one poem, or is this it?
Yeah, if it's a short one, yeah. I think
Yes, I was actually very short. It's a poem which is about taking my younger daughter to the hotel, and this was her first time in Israel many years ago when she was little. And of course, she hesitated to go to the right, and basically I just took her with me, and which was a violation, but I felt well justified. And that's what the poem is about. Wailing Wall. In a black ankle-length skirt purchased in Mea Shearim, in a girl's clothing basement, a white band on her brow, a white cloud on the blue sky draped over Jerusalem. My younger daughter, Tatiana Rebecca, accompanied me to the hotel. When we reached the boundary where men and boys turn to the north and women and girls to the south, I'm scared to go alone, my daughter said, and I led her, a girl, a boy, a butterfly, where the pilgrims flowed. We forded the crowd, found a crevice between the time-molten stones, and inserted our notes into languages. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, hold on. I called this up before I introduce our next author. I'll just share two quick images. So anyone wants to come to Israel and volunteer with me in the agricultural sector, here we are with our plums and our apricots. And we happen to have copies of our books with us that day. So we took one, apricots and the books. Anyway, okay. Back to literary Modiin. I'm happy to introduce our third author. Danila Botha is the critically acclaimed author of 5 books, including the short story collections Got No Secrets and the Trillium Book Award, Vine Awards, and Relist Awards finalist for All the Men and Some of the Women I've Known. Her new collection, Things That Cause Inappropriate Happiness, was published by Guernica Editions in April 2024. Stories from it have appeared in Canadian, American, and European literary journals, from the Antagonist Review and Grain Magazine to Flights Magazine, Bristol Noir, and the Berlin Review. So Danila, and she's coming to us from Toronto today. So let me spotlight you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Julie. It's a pleasure and an honor to read here as part of your series and to read with Ellis and Maxim. And it's so exciting because I have family and friends from Israel who are listening. And I noticed at least like one writer whose work I love is here in the audience, Dan. That's amazing. Yeah, this is my new collection, Things That Cause Inappropriate Happiness. It's such an interesting time, and I'm being euphemistic when I say interesting, to be a Jewish writer. I never imagined, I don't know what it's been like for everyone who's here, but I've never experienced such overt anti-Semitism in the arts and in publishing the way that I've seen and observed things this time. My publisher is Guernica Editions, which has nothing to do with Guernica Magazine. I just felt the need to clarify after hearing about that. Actually, I'm really grateful. My publisher, Michael Murrell, and the whole team is fantastic and very supportive of Jewish writers. They also publish Shrayer and a bunch of other Israeli and Jewish writers and international writers. So, yeah, that's cool. Hi, Avner. It's always really cool to get to see, to get to know that other writers whose work you love are in the audience of an event you're doing. This collection has 32 short stories. I didn't set out intending to write a collection that dealt so much with Jewish themes. It felt organic and sort of happened incidentally. I was looking at characters, a lot of characters who are artists or writers, sculptors, musicians, who are exploring different facets of their identity in general, and a lot of things in life just kind of got in there. I was doing research for a graphic novel that I'm in the middle of writing and illustrating right now. Part of that story was set during World War II, and you know, when you do research, you end up reading a lot of things that aren't necessarily directly connected to what you're doing, but the stories are powerful and they stay in your mind. So I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to read from one of the short stories in here. It's called Able to Pass. It didn't take much to remember what she'd learned. Because of all the Jewish traditions, this was the strangest. Judaism insisted that you couldn't mix wool and linen, that owning pigeons made you an ineligible witness, and that waving a live chicken around your head before Rosh Hashanah was the best way to get rid of that year's sins. And yet, here she was. She almost started to laugh, but she'd caught her grandmother's eye. Her bubby, who floated in and out of the Toronto winter and the Polish countryside. They would sit on her green velvet couch, swallowed by pillows, her grandmother's PSW Anita waiting to bring them tea with lemon and sugar, and rugelach bursting with poppy seeds. Her bubby, with her intense eyes, which could change from a winter blue to the softer, muddier melt of a spring river. She didn't say I love you much, but Kayla understood when she was being nagged to eat more lakshan kugel or dry, crumbly honey cake, to wear a scarf even when she wasn't cold, but especially when her bubby wanted to tell her things she'd never told anybody else. We tried to build a golem, she said the last time Kayla visited. A what? A golem, me and Golda. We didn't know the right words, but Golda had a friend, a secret boyfriend who'd been learning at the yeshiva, so she knew some. We made her from dust and mud at the riverbank. She looked Kayla in the eye and waved her hand. A creature, you know, a creature that looks like a person. You make them from clay or mud, and then in time... What? They begin to exist. Her bubby laughed, and the collection of colorful and kitschy matryoshka dolls on the windowsill behind her caught Kayla's eye. Inside one of them were small odds and ends that survived the war with her. Her mother's ring, a bead from her sister's necklace, tiny notes that could fit under her tongue. They're not quite the same of us, you know, but they look human, and they protect us. That's their job. What exactly were you planning to do? Kayla blurted out before she could stop herself. Oh, I don't know, darling, she answered. People were disappearing every day. There was a rumor, you know, a young man who escaped and came back, all hanging skin and bone and missing nails. He hid with the dead bodies on the train, then with the luggage that was being sent back. He said they were looking for twins. Our father was gone by then, so we couldn't decide if we'd be saved or hunted if we stayed. We thought we could replace ourselves so our real versions could hide. She shook her head, a faint half smile playing on her lips, and Kayla tried not to stare. If it had worked, she realized. Bubby's sister would have survived, and their family wouldn't have been so tiny. That night, Kayla started to research. She learned about it in school, of course, and she had her grandmother's fragments, but she started to read about her grandmother's village in southern Poland. She read about Sefer Yetzirah and other sources of Jewish magic and mysticism. She read the Clay Boy and the Quittermeister papers. She even reread Frankenstein. She had posters of her grandmother from before the war, back when she was Basia Davidovich, Basia to her Polish friends, blonde and blue-eyed, tall and social, able to pass. Her mother, Leica, died when she was 10, and Basia was jealous sometimes that her mother got to miss the suffering and that their town and friends and family were frozen in a state of comfort and mendacity in her mind. Basia could have hidden, but all she had left was her delicate, dark-haired twin, her brilliant sister, the punchline of many family jokes. I should have been named Golda, she could hear her bubby say. Look at my hair, my personality, when the real Golda was always so serious. Kayla was an art major who minored in accounting to keep her parents happy. Her bubby had once told her that her name meant vessel of God, that being able to create was her gift. She drew her family members first with pencil and charcoal, slowly adding color. She ordered bags of clay, spray bottles for water, elephant ear sponges, potter ribs, and toggle clay cutters. She would make them all fit inside each other, with her grandmother on the outside, then Golda, their mother and father, and then their grandmother. The next time she visited her grandmother, she walked over to her shelf and touched the dolls. Her bubby watched her with tired eyes, but didn't say anything. She opened up the one full of her treasures and took 4 of the tiny pieces of paper. If she noticed, she didn't say anything. That night, Kayla finished each piece. She worried if each face had enough detail, if they looked real, if they fit inside each other properly. After she fired them on a small kiln near her house, she brought them home and put a note in each of their mouths. The next morning, she woke up to find her figurines smashed to pieces, the pieces of paper crumpled all around them. She staggered into her hallway, where she heard a competing chorus of voices coming from her kitchen. An older woman turned her head away from the stove and smiled at her. There was something about her nose and her cheekbones, the intensity of her eyebrows, that was so familiar. Kayla squinted. Golda? Golda's chest shook with laughter. Of course, Maidele. Who were you expecting? The queen? A woman her mother's age and a girl her age blinked back at her from her glass IKEA table. The girl couldn't quite pass as her sister, but there was a definite family resemblance. Frida, get your cousin a glass of water. Kayla, have you been drinking again? Kayla was about to answer when she heard her phone ring. She padded back to her bedroom and answered. I knew you could do it, her bubby said, without even saying hello first. Her laughter rang out clear and unguarded. Thank you so much.
Are you done? Is that
Yeah.
oh, okay? Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much. I'm gonna add a spotlight, everybody's spotlights here, all the authors. So while you guys are thinking of your questions, please start putting them in the chat. Okay, here we all are. Okay, well, while you're thinking of your questions, I have a few questions, comments, I don't know exactly. That you just read, that her grandmother was jealous a bit of her mother because she got to because she died before all the suffering. I think that's something we can all identify with a bit, especially now, and thinking, people that are died and got to miss this terrible time we're living through in Jewish history. I don't really know if I have a question in here. It just struck me. I am glad to hear that your publishers are really supportive. I know Guernica also published Nora Gold.
That's right. Yes,
right.
That's right.
Who was here a few months ago. And in fact, when Nora was here, she mentioned that, and the editor of JewishFiction.net, which I think, Ellis, you've been published there, and Maxim, you've been published there. No, soon coming. And okay,
my late father,
your father was published there.
That's so cool.
My mother and my older daughter have co-translated, which I'm very happy about.
Awesome.
Cool. That's amazing. Wow.
Anyway, Nora mentioned that the number one topic that they get stories about are golems. So
that's so funny. That's so funny. Yeah, I've never written about it before, but like I love Cynthia Ozick and all the people that have written about it, and I thought, what if it was possible to actually change history?
Yeah.
That
was
cool. No, I think the sentiment also of of jealousy that I read it, a survivor actually expressed something like that. That like it's good that this person died before because they didn't have to see all of this, and the town and their memories and everything could stay intact.
Yeah,
like I wish I could take credit for that, but yeah, no, it's something I came across in my research. It was really heartbreaking to me too.
Yeah. You also mentioned that each story your stories kind of came up organically one after, like how I want to ask Ellis and Maxim also. Is that how it works for you? I mean, how does the writing process work? Did you where do you come up with your poems or your stories? You feel like things developed organically from one story to the next, or poem to the next?
I can answer. I told in my talk that the story of Bulgarian Jewry during the war was something I had to tell. So that I was looking for the way to express that. And it was a long story, so it took quite a while till I found an online literary magazine that would agree to publish it. Other stories came to my mind because, again, I was an Israeli living for a short time in Bulgaria and experiencing the country as an outsider. So many of the stories deal exactly with that. People coming to Israel to be a diplomat in the Israeli embassy, to visit on their school break or whatever, to study in Sofia, people coming and seeing things for the first time. But I tried to balance that with stories told by native Bulgarians that I kind of put myself in their shoes. How would they go about their daily life? And not necessarily well-to-do Bulgarians, but as I mentioned, a Romani woman, a refugee from Syria, police chief in a Rhodope mountain village. All these made their way into the story as well.
Maxim, what about you for your poems?
Well, so I'll speak to the poetry because I also write fiction and nonfiction, but that's a different. For me, writing fiction and nonfiction is much more of a labor of discipline, and I can work on it day in and day out. Poetry, because most of my poetry is lyrical, despite a certain narrative and polemical undertone. I tend to write it because I have an impulse, like the title poem in this collection, Kinship, I wrote on the morning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I wrote it in English, and then I wrote a parallel version in Russian, and those clearly came from the impulse of hearing the news. And then the collection really wrote itself because it built its poems, its language, its diction around these four questions that I mentioned: the war in Ukraine, anti-Semitism in America, the legacy of the Soviet legacy, and of course my intimate relationship with Israel.
Go ahead, Danila, do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add, I love listening to what inspires other writers to write. For me, I started actually with about half of the amount of stories, or less than half, when I originally submitted it to Guernica, and I enjoyed working with Michael as my editor also so much that I would email him. We were both like middle of the night writers, and I would email him in the middle of the night and say, "I had this idea. I was thinking that I might write about this. Do you think I could add it to the collection?" And he'd always say, "Yeah, that sounds interesting," or "Yeah, that sounds really great. You know what? Finish the story, add it to the collection, put it where you'd like it to be, because I can't picture and I can't imagine what I would do with that without seeing it in context." And within, like, it felt like minutes, the collection now has 32 stories. It had about 18 when I first started.
Oh, that's very
So
fat. Like, how long did it take you to all those the other like 14 stories? How long did it take you from when you had submitted it to like?
The truth is that I'm always writing short fiction.
Mhm.
And the way my process has always been is that, like, no matter what else I'm working on, or no matter what else I'm doing, like I'm always doing it. So I instead of like saving it for another collection, which I think normally, like with my first book and my first two collections of short stories, they were like very like they're very unified by theme and very specific. Like For All the Men and Some of the Women I've Known were about, friendships and romantic relationships and those kind of things. And like there was like the process of falling in love, falling out of love. It's sort of just like divided into categories. I'm actually really excited because the publisher of that folded a few years ago, and Greenwich is actually reissuing it next year.
Really nice. That's
I'm
great.
really excited about that, yeah. But like, for example, like it was very organized by theme, and this time the themes kind of revealed themselves organically. I wasn't conscious of. I'm just grateful that in a time like this, a book that actually has a lot of Jewish content and a lot of Jewish identity and a lot of different kinds of Jewish themes is being well received. I'm just unbelievably grateful, because I have heard and I know that that's not always the way. So I'm just grateful.
That's right. That actually brings us to our next question from Fran.
Okay.
Right. How have the events of October 7th and the last 10 months in Israel and abroad impacted on your writing practice? You don't want to go first?
No, I'll go first. I also write nonfiction but it's been a little difficult to come up with answers or opinions when there's so many people talking about what's going on. I have written short stories connected to these past 10 months, but again, this is not an easy thing to write on. So I looked for happier tales or different tales. One of the story is about volunteering, picking pomelos in a farm near the Gaza Strip. Another of the stories about an Israeli soldier who comes back from serving in Gaza with a dog, and we don't know if the dog belonged to a Palestinian family in Gaza or what his connection is to that dog. But these stories obviously didn't fit in this current book, which was written many years ago. But someday they could appear in a future book. We'll see.
I guess to add to that, the terrible truth is that one gets used to almost anything. And I know this because of the almost 9 years that my family spent as refugeniks. I'm not comparing suffering, but simply have something to relate to. The first several months after the war, I literally woke up every day with things that I wanted to express, and I wrote a lot of polemical essays for the Jewish American press, and also I started writing a poetry collection, which is now gonna come out. I wrote no fiction whatsoever, and then I kind of turned to how the war was impacting American society. That led to essentially spending 3 months of this year, January, February, and March, researching a 2-part series on poetry after October 7th and on Jewish poets, which Tablet ran. Basically, it's a monographic length study where I surveyed 70 Jewish poets and translators extensively. But my point is, you can only do these things once. You cannot do another article and put Jewish poetry after October 7th. So I think one starts turning to other topics, and I feel like I'm at that stage. I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. And I guess one other peculiarity is that some of the work I do exists in parallel worlds in the Russian language and in the English language. And so it kind of multiplies the tasks, which is both exhilarating but also kind of burdensome. But there you have it. Thank you.
These are such great answers. For me, I take time to process things. I almost never, like, I guess because I write fiction and I primarily write short fiction, so I've definitely needed, like there's a lot going on in terms of what's shared online and the details and the information, and it's really hard to process, and it's hard to I speak to my family and my friends in Israel almost like all the time, and just hearing and reading and seeing pictures and seeing the videos that have been released and everything. It's so hard to put it into some kind of context where you can imagine writing about it in that way. I don't really write nonfiction, so it's been what's been really hard, like as a writer, not just in terms of like writing and material, because I always take time to think about things. I don't respond to things quickly in that way, but in terms of just the industry and the open shift to talking about, like, to jump from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism and the openness with which that's happened. Even hearing the term anti-Zionism on I felt like, I don't know, I feel old when I make this reference, but there was like an episode of The Simpsons from the 90s where um Mr. Burns is talking to Lisa, this old man on the show is talking to a kid, and she says recycling, and he goes through a mental dictionary in his head, and he's like, recycling, and the closest word he can come up with is ragamuffin, and he like ruffles her hair. The first time I remember hearing people talking about anti-Zionism, I was like, anti-Zionism? Like, I was like, what's that? Like, I was like, what does that mean? And I had no idea. Like a few years ago, I write very little nonfiction, but a few years ago in 2015, I wrote a piece for Huffington Post that was about violence that had happened in Renana, where a lot of my family lives, like similar to what happened today or yesterday in Holland, that kind of terrorism. And I wrote about how I'm just gonna say that I'm openly Zionist now because and I had no idea that in other people's minds, Zionism was equals white supremacy, or Zionism equals like I really, it seems like stupid, but I honestly had no idea that that was the perception of it, and that it would just increase from there. Like I've had a few things in my career. I was supposed to do a festival, and then I heard that it was because I had written this a few years ago when For All the Men was out, and I heard it was because they found this editorial, and there was supposed to be a Palestinian writer who was going to be part of it, and he wasn't comfortable being part of it because he read my editorial. I said nothing about Palestinians. I said nothing about not caring about their land. Like, it was like, that's not what I said at all, and that's what happened, for example. So I'm not as, I want to be more shocked by everything that's happening. I'm just, in our industry and publishing, like the way that people are so openly hateful and anti-Semitic, but it's definitely hard to deal with. Like, and that's been something that I've been writing. I wrote a short story that's actually coming out in the Opiate magazine next month. It's called Complicatedly Jewish, and it's about a character who is an artist who, like a visual artist who, like has a show, is having a show, and has a complicated relationship with Judaism. The owner of the gallery, has a Jewish dad, and a very anti-Zionist stance on a lot of things, and it negotiates like what it's like to negotiate these things. Because I took some of the wildest things that I heard people say, and I thought, like, how can they really believe this? Like, how can Jewish people think this? Like, how is this possible? Like, where does this come from? And so I guess I've written about it a little bit in that way, but what's happened in Israel feels too close, and so unbelievably painful and horrible. I haven't been able to write about it yet. I hope I'll be able to in time.
Yeah, I can't. There's a few people that have started writing fiction about it. Ellis, I didn't
Yeah.
know you had also, but Chaim Watzman, who we had
Mm.
here a few times. I was like, and he first came out with like a fiction story really quickly within a few weeks. I was like, oh my God,
Yeah.
how does he been doing that? For me, I stopped. I had a couple months where I stopped working on what I had been working on, which was a short story, unrelated, like takes place in 1939 in the States. So, but I wrote a few essays, and the first of which was like in the first 10 days, I wasn't even sure if what I was writing was coherent at all. I just had to like, I had to get it out.
Yeah.
And another one about my my agricultural, this profound experience I had picking avocados in Kibbutz Sa'ad, which then led me to start volunteering every week. But then after a couple of months, I was able to kind of go back to my short stories, because they really don't, they all take place long before October 7th, and to now to this novel project I have going, which also is going to be dealing with the Holocaust, but I'm not even up to that yet. So I'm sort of able to compartmentalize and go back to writing fiction about that. But the thought of writing fiction about our current moment, which is like a seeming eternity, not a moment, is okay. We have a couple more minutes, and Tessie had a question. Maxim, how does your daughter Tatiana feel in retrospect about Israel and the Kotel, and how does your family feel about Israel's difficult situation? And that's a question for all of the writers. And I'm just going to add another question I had from Maxim onto that, which is, what what do you think we can learn or take away from the war in Ukraine for our current situation, if you have any insights to share on that?
So thank you. I think one thing I've learned is not to speak for teenage children in the non-fictional mode. So what I have expressed in fiction, and I think we should leave it as that. As far as my family's connection with Israel, it runs deep, and we are daily in touch with our family. In fact, we just spoke to a cousin yesterday. I spoke to another cousin today. So that is an ongoing relationship. And I can only imagine how difficult it is to conceive of the state of being in Israel when a cousin says to me, we're glued to the TV watching the Olympics while we're also thinking that the attack is imminent. So it is heartbreaking just to think about it, and that's the reality. And then, Julie, very briefly to your very important question, I'd say, in the interest of time, I'll just make one important point, which I didn't come up with. It's a point that Jewish-centered journalists have been making and political commentators have been making for a while, which is that Iran is fighting on the side of Russia in Ukraine. A lot of people don't know this, but Iran is the principal supplier of drones that Russia's military uses. It means that basically Israel and Ukraine have the same enemy in Iran, and that in turn is a thought-provoking line of inquiry. And so I think there are many lessons for what's going on today in the recent, well, not so recent experience in Ukraine. And those are lessons of solidarity above all else. Thank you.
Well, it's really beautiful. By the way, I just want to quickly tell people, like, when we were talking about publishers that have been so supportive and supportive of Jewish writers, I know Julie because I won this contest or I came second place in this contest for my short fiction for one of the stories that like was made longer into a story in this collection by Press 53. And they had this contest, and Kevin Watson was Julie's publisher. And we were talking because I actually asked him, because he had been so supportive of the stories, if he would do distribution in the US, and he explained to me that Guernica's distribution and his use the same distributor and how complicated, and he was like, but there's this other writer whose work I think you'd really like, and she lives in Israel. And I was like, really? Who's that? And I ordered the book of Jeremiah, which was amazing, and which I loved so much. Sorry, my kids are outside, as you can hear. Sorry. But yeah, no, I loved it, and I read it and I loved it. And then Nora, who we actually launched at the same time and we're friends also, and she said, oh, you should, I'm doing this event for Literary Modiin, and I wish that I was so excited. I wish I could be there in person to meet you in real life, and I would totally go volunteer to do agricultural stuff with you anytime. That sounds amazing.
That's what we say. Anyone who comes,
you know what? My family's business is agriculture. My dad's company. My dad's an agronomist. My family makes like fertilizers and stuff. That's actually my family's business. So that's really funny. Small world. Like, no, I love doing stuff like that. Just to answer the question really quickly. Sorry about yeah, I also speak to my family all the time. Actually, some of my family are here listening to this, which is so special and amazing. And I speak to my friends on a daily or weekly basis also. One of my friends was saying the other day, like, you know, you're in Israel when you're going to watch Olympic events, but you have like extra chargers in your bag and all these extra things just in case something happens in the moment. Like the reality of living with that. I've lived there too, so I know. I was actually living there during the war in 2006, so I know what it's like to, and I've like spent a lot of summers there, and when there were piguim and all kinds of things, like I know in some way what it's like. But this war has gone on for so long, and it's the attacks from so many sides. It's so hard, and then there's also so many civilian deaths on both sides. I mean, terrible things. Like it's hard not to be deeply paralyzingly afraid and upset and all the time, and not to feel completely helpless and not to feel like they're like it's just it's hard. And it's hard to be, and it sounds funny to say this, but it's hard to be so far away. Like it's hard when your heart feels so connected and
I think
you have
Maxim
so
wants to
much
say something. He's raising his hand.
I just want to say only because I saw Gila Bar's face in the audience, and I would like to simply mention that 3 very important Jewish publications have emerged since October 7th that specifically are there to highlight Jewish writing and pro-Israel writing. One of them is Iron Words Israel, which was founded by Gila Bar. Another one is off the book, which Susie Gordon, the Jewish English writer, started. And the third one is The Green Golem, which Alex Horn, a Jewish American writer, started. I think some of us have published in these, and I just want to give them another mention because these publications are essential in today's climate, not only because of their advocacy for the state of Israel, but because they are creating new spaces for Jewish writing.
Definitely. I wrote about this in my newsletter last month. And there's a few. And the Judith magazine is also, did you say that one? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned, someone mentioned being published by Esoterica. They're also amazing about, Leah is amazing about publishing that kind of stuff too.
I don't know if the book is new, but it was new to me. And Zeva was on here, I think, had a story. Yeah, so there's a lot of there are good things happening also.
For sure.
But Ellis, I didn't have a chance to answer the last question if you wanted to answer.
Well, as someone whose entire close family lives in Israel, it's a little hard to see what is not known overseas. I mean, everything, as Julie started tonight's session, life is pretty normal, but we live in a war zone here. We've been at war since October 7th, but we've been at war. The state of Israel has been at war much longer than that. But we live here, we work, we enjoy the nature, we get out of life goes on. And it's hard to tell people overseas that we're at war. It's hard to express that because they don't speak the same kind of language that we. On the other hand, our government says we're prepared for war. We've been in war since forever, and it's just not getting better. It's hard to understand this parallel, we're okay, but we're not okay situation.
Mamash. Okay, we're just about out of time, and I will send around tomorrow the recording and the links, but I do want to mention, I'll share my screen because I've already scheduled the next few sessions. And so you can go to the Literary Modiin page on my website. We have on September 15th, we have Bat Nadiv Hakarmi reading from her poetry collection, The Love of Mortal Beings. Sasha Vasilyuk, Your Presence is Mandatory. That's her debut novel. And Lynn Gladner, Cave of Secrets. And then I've already scheduled another solidarity session to commemorate 1 year since October 6th, since October 7th. It will be on October 6th. So you can already sign up for that as well. And last thing I want to do is end with, as I do every time since October 7th, with the prayer for our hostages. And I'm just going to read it in Hebrew, and you all can follow along in Hebrew or the English. Misha Berach Avoteno v'Imoteno Abraham v'Sara Yitzchak v'Rivka Yaakov Leah v'Rachel ve'ed lochamenu Yehoshua David v'Yehuda Dvorah Yael v'Yehudit hu yevarech et shvuyei v'nederei tzahal v'ezrachim v'ezrachiyot hachatufim v'chatufot hanetunim v'netunot v'shivya u'v'tzara. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני צבאות, שתפדה נפשם משבי ותחזירם במהרה לארצם למשפחתם ולביתם, בריאים ושלמים בגופם ובנפשם, ותיתן תבונה בלב העמלים לשחרורם, ותיתן רחמים בלב שוביהם, ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כל ברמה נשמע נהי בכי תמרורים רחל מבכה על בניה מענן להנחם על בניה כי איננו כה אמר אדוני מנעי קולך מבכי ועינייך מדמעה כי יש שכר לפעולתך נאום אדוני ושבו מארץ אויב ויש תקווה לאחריתך נאום אדוני ושבו בנים ובנות לגבולם. And that is from Yirmiyahu Lamed Aleph, the original book of Jeremiah. So I'm going to stop my share. Wait, there was one more thing in the chat. Yep. Okay. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to especially thank our authors tonight, Ellis, Maxim, and Danila. Go out and buy their books and read their books and review their books. They're all wonderful. And yeah, may we have a quiet evening, a quiet week, and an end to all the fighting and less suffering for everybody all around. So, Laila Tov.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, guys.
Right.